I thought the worst thing that could happen was getting rejected. Then the hiring manager smiled, like she had just stepped on broken glass, and whispered that they could not move forward because Mrs. Park already works here. My husband's last name is Park. I have been married to him for 8 years. So tell me, who exactly have I been sharing my life with? And who has been wearing my name like a stolen designer coat? My name is Harper Rivera. I was sitting in my car outside the sleek, glass and steel headquarters of Astorvale Systems in Austin, Texas, staring at the interview confirmation on my phone screen like it was a ransom note. The Texas sun was beating down on the windshield, turning the leather interior of my sedan into an oven, but my hands felt entirely like ice. The irony of the situation was thick enough to choke on. I was about to walk into a final round interview for a senior strategy role at a company founded and run by my husband of 8 years, Julian Park. And he had absolutely no idea I was sitting in his parking lot. For almost a decade, Julian had been fiercely adamant about keeping his worlds entirely separate. He claimed he hated mixing business and marriage, insisting that our home should remain a quiet sanctuary, completely insulated from the brutal, cutthroat realities of the tech industry. I had respected that boundary for years. I had shrunk my own fierce ambitions, stepping away from my career to manage his life, his chaotic travel calendar, and the endless social obligations he no longer had the time or desire to attend. But today, at 35 years old, I was crossing that line. I had applied for this position using my maiden name, Rivera, a name I had kept legally, to ensure my resume was judged entirely on merit and not on nepotism. I locked the car doors and walked toward the towering entrance. The lobby was a breathtaking temple of minimalist corporate wealth, all polished concrete floors and sprawling living walls. I approached the front desk, offered my name, and received a temporary visitor badge. Clipping the plastic square to the lapel of my tailored blazer felt like pinning a glowing target directly over my heart. Stepping into the elevator, I pressed the button for the 42nd floor. My hands were trembling so visibly that I had to clasp them together tightly in front of me to hide the shaking. I spent the 2-minute ascent frantically rehearsing my answers, silently repeating the brand strategy metrics and revenue growth projections I had relentlessly memorized over the past 3 weeks. I was ready to prove to myself, and eventually to Julian, that I was not just the supportive wife fading into the domestic background. I was a professional powerhouse in my own right. Kendra Slate, the director of human resources, met me at the glass-walled reception area. She was sharp, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, and possessed that practiced, magnetic corporate warmth that made you feel like you were the only person in the world who mattered. For the first 45 minutes of our meeting, the interview was absolutely flawless. Kendra was genuinely impressed by my portfolio, nodding enthusiastically as I broke down my aggressive, data-driven ideas for Astorvale's upcoming market expansion. I could feel the job offer practically resting in the palm of my hand. The heavy, anxious tension in my shoulders finally began to melt away. We were wrapping up the session when Kendra leaned back in her ergonomic chair, folding her hands neatly on her pristine mahogany desk. "Harper, your background is truly exceptional," Kendra said, her smile bright and genuine. "There is just one final procedural question we have to cover for candidates coming in at the director level. It is a strict standard compliance measure. Do you have any known conflicts of interest, or any familial relationships with current employees or executives here at Astorvale Systems?" I took a slow, steadying breath. This was the moment, the grand reveal I had planned to deliver with casual, elegant grace. I kept my posture relaxed, smoothed the fabric of my skirt, and answered calmly, offering a soft, confident smile. "Actually, yes, my husband is Julian Park, your chief executive officer." Kendra did not smile back. She did not chuckle at the surprise, nor did she offer the polite, shocked congratulations I had anticipated. Instead, her entire demeanor shattered right in front of me. The professional warmth drained from her face in an instant, leaving behind a pale, rigid mask of sheer panic. She froze completely, her eyes darting quickly toward the closed glass door of her office, as if terrified someone might be listening in the hallway. The silence stretched on for 5 agonizing seconds. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. Then, Kendra leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh, forced whisper that detonated the very foundation of my reality. "We cannot move forward with this application, Harper, because Mrs. Park already works here." I let out a short, breathy laugh. It was an involuntary reflex, a desperate attempt by my brain to process an equation that made zero logical sense. "I am so sorry," I said, my voice light and dismissive, trying to bridge the sudden, awkward gap. "I think there has been a massive misunderstanding. Park is an incredibly common last name in this industry. You must be thinking of someone else." Kendra did not blink. She looked at me with a sickening mixture of terror and deep, heavy pity, a combination that made my stomach drop into a bottomless void. She slowly shook her head. "There is no misunderstanding," Kendra said, her words tight, careful, and laced with pure dread. "She is listed in our company directory as the head of operations, and she reports directly to him." My throat closed entirely. The oxygen vanished from the meticulously climate-controlled office. The sleek glass walls seemed to vibrate and close in around me. I could hear the faint hum of the overhead air conditioning, the distant ringing of a desk phone down the hall, and the deafening, frantic roar of my own pulse pounding in my ears. I forced myself to sit perfectly still. I forced myself to look Kendra directly in the eyes. I needed to ask one single question. It sounded so simple, so painfully ordinary, but I knew with absolute certainty that the answer would violently divide my life into a before and an after. "What?" I started, pausing to force the air through my violently constricted throat. "Is her first name?" Kendra hesitated. She looked exactly like a woman standing on the jagged edge of a cliff, desperately trying to choose between her professional survival and basic human honesty. She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to her neatly organized desk before slowly, reluctantly rising to meet my eyes again. "Camille," Kendra whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Camille Park." I did not scream. I did not flip the heavy mahogany desk, nor did I demand to be marched down the hall and into Julian's corner office to confront him. I simply stood up. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely hollow. I reached down for my leather tote bag, slung it over my shoulder with mechanical precision, and quietly thanked Kendra for her time. I walked out of the glass office, down the brightly lit corporate corridor, and back into the sleek elevator. I rode it down 42 floors in total. Suffocating silence. I walked through the cavernous lobby, stepped through the sliding glass doors, and walked back out into the blistering Texas heat. I did not cry. As I walked back to my car, my vision remained perfectly clear. I was not holding back tears because I was a fiercely strong, unbreakable woman who refused to shatter. I was not crying simply because my body had not yet caught up to the catastrophic magnitude of the betrayal. The trauma was still in transit. Right now, I was just a ghost, walking away from a corporate headquarters, staring at the wreckage of a life that I suddenly realized no longer belonged to me. The drive back to our house was a suffocating blur of highway lines and blinding afternoon sun. My mind played a cruel, involuntary trick, rapidly rewinding the tape of our life together to search for the exact moment the ground beneath my feet had turned to quicksand. I was not always the quiet woman waiting in the pristine kitchen. Back in my late 20s, I was a shark. I was a senior brand strategist at a top-tier firm, a woman who pitched aggressive marketing campaigns to Fortune 500 leadership teams without a single tremor in my voice. I lived on adrenaline, black coffee, and the electric thrill of a well-executed launch. I was sharp, relentlessly ambitious, and fiercely independent. Julian used to look at me with awe. He loved my fire, or at least, he swore he did. Then his tech startup caught a huge wave of momentum. The transition in our dynamic was insidious, dressed up beautifully as a temporary necessity for our shared future. I vividly remember sitting on the floor of our cramped first apartment, eating cheap takeout among boxes of investor prospectuses. When he took both of my hands in his, he looked exhausted but hungry. He told me he needed me to hold down life for us. He said if he had to worry about the mortgage, the groceries, and the scheduling, his company would sink before it even learned to swim. He asked me to help him build his empire by securing our foundation. I did not quit my thriving career because I was weak, or because I secretly yearned to be a kept woman fading into the background. I stepped back out of profound love. I believed a marriage was an ecosystem, and right then, his side of the soil desperately needed all the water. It was supposed to be a sacrifice of maybe 18 months, 2 years at the absolute maximum, but the temporary arrangement calcified into our permanent reality. Astorvale Systems exploded into a major industry player, and Julian vanished into the slipstream of his own staggering success. The excuses for his absence became a familiar, rhythmic litany that I learned to accept without question. There were endless investor dinners that stretched past midnight. There were late-night software deploys requiring all hands on deck. There were exhausting, mandatory conference weekends in San Francisco, Seattle, and New York. While he was out conquering the tech world and accumulating wealth, my fierce identity slowly and quietly evaporated. I became the highly efficient project manager of our domestic existence. My universe shrank to maintaining the flawless aesthetic of our sprawling home, meticulously managing our shared calendar, and attending the tedious social obligations he constantly bailed on, always armed with a polite, practiced excuse for my husband's absence. I woke up one morning a few months after turning 35, looked around my beautifully curated, terrifyingly silent living room, and realized I felt entirely invisible. I needed to return to the workforce. It was never about the money. Julian had made more money than we could possibly spend in 3 lifetimes. I needed to feel the friction of a real challenge again. I needed to be a noun, a person with agency, not just an adjective quietly attached to his powerful name. When the senior strategy role opened up at Astorvale, it felt like a direct dare from the universe. It was an opportunity to prove to the board, to the industry, and most importantly to myself, that I was not merely the CEO's invisible wife. I kept my maiden name, Rivera, on every single piece of application paperwork. I wanted to walk through the front door purely on the merit of my own mind, bypassing the stain of nepotism entirely. I had planned to slap the official offer letter on the kitchen counter one evening and watch his jaw drop in impressed disbelief. Instead, I was the one whose reality had been obliterated. Gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles stark white, a cold, venomous clarity washed over my panic. I remembered every single time over the past few years that Julian had gently but firmly shut down my offers to attend company holiday parties or drop off lunch at his office. I heard his voice echoing in the quiet cabin of my car, insisting that he had to keep his worlds separate. He always said he absolutely hated mixing business and marriage because he despised drama at work. The truth hit me so hard it physically knocked the breath from my lungs. He did not enforce those strict boundaries to protect my peace or to preserve the sanctity of our home. He did not hate drama. He hated witnesses. He needed the walls around his corporate life built incredibly high so I could not see who was sitting comfortably on the other side. That evening, I sat at our custom marble dining table, nursing a glass of dark red wine. The front door clicked open at exactly 8:30. Julian walked in, loosening his expensive silk tie, looking perfectly exhausted and relentlessly handsome. He kissed the top of my head, poured himself a glass of sparkling water, and sat directly across from me. He immediately launched into a polished monologue about his day, passionately detailing a keynote speech he was drafting for an upcoming summit about integrity, culture, and transparent leadership. I sat perfectly still and watched his mouth move. I watched the earnest, practiced furrow of his brow, and the way his hands animated his words. They were the exact same hands I had held for 8 years. Yet I felt a chilling disconnect. I was eating dinner beside a complete and utter stranger, a man who could sit in his own dining room and preach about corporate morality while a woman named Camille occupied an executive office down the hall from him, wearing his last name like a stolen designer coat. My name. A primal, violent urge rose in my chest. I wanted to hurl my heavy wine glass against the immaculate white wall behind him. I wanted to flip the marble table, grab him by his tailored collar, and scream. I wanted to demand to know exactly how long he had been carving my soul into pieces while I spent my youth polishing his life. But I swallowed the scream. I let the glass remain perfectly still in my hand. I nodded at his story, offering a soft, agreeable smile. If I confronted him right now, crying and erratic, he would use the chaos against me. Julian was a master negotiator, a man who spun complex narratives and manipulated boardrooms for a living. If I showed my hand, he would gaslight me, call me crazy, and systematically lock down every single vulnerability he had before I could find the proof. I could not afford to act on raw grief. I needed to know exactly what game I was trapped in before I made my first move. For now, the most dangerous weapon I possessed was the one thing he had absolutely no idea I had. I knew the truth. The house was dead silent, save for the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the man sleeping upstairs. It was 2 a.m. I slipped out from under the heavy duvet, my bare feet making absolutely zero sound against the cold hardwood floor. I did not go to the kitchen for a glass of water. I went straight down the hall to his private study. The air in the room was chillingly still, smelling faintly of cedar and his expensive imported cologne. His silver laptop sat closed on the significant mahogany desk. A sleeping beast holding the blueprints to my destruction. I opened the lid. The screen flared to life instantly, casting a harsh, blue, cinematic glow across my face and throwing long shadows against the walls. I knew his passcode. It was our wedding anniversary. The sickening irony tasted like copper in my mouth as I slowly typed the digits. He was always so careful, so meticulously guarded, but arrogance often breeds laziness. He had left his browser open. My fingers flew across the glass trackpad, navigating directly to the Astorvale internal employee portal. I typed her name into the global search bar. The profile loaded in less than a second. Head of Operations. I bypassed her page and clicked on Julian's executive profile, digging into the restricted Human Resources tab that only an administrator, or a logged-in chief executive, could access. There, under the mandatory emergency contact fields, the screen displayed a truth so blunt it felt like a physical blow to the sternum. Primary contact, Camille Park. Relationship, spouse. I opened a new, private tab, stepping out of the company intranet and into the cold, public sphere of the internet. I needed a timeline. I found her professional networking profile immediately. Her tenure at Astorvale Systems began exactly 32 months ago. My mind instantly snapped back to that specific autumn. That was the exact season Julian claimed his company was undergoing a substantial, volatile restructuring phase, a crisis that allegedly required him to spend 4 days a week in a completely different time zone. The sudden, agonizing spike in his work travel was never a corporate necessity. It was a second life taking root in real time. I dug deeper, abandoning professional sites for the messy trail of social media. I uncovered an obscure public gallery from the company's annual executive retreat in Aspen last winter. I scrolled through dozens of high-resolution images of executives holding drinks and giving presentations until I found them. They were standing near a sweeping stone fireplace in a crowded lodge. It was not a professional pose. Camille was leaning into his space, her hand resting naturally on his forearm. It was the casual, effortless gravity of a woman completely certain of her territory, touching a man who belonged to her. Then, I zoomed in on his wrist. The silver dial of a platinum chronograph caught the flash of the camera. I had purchased that exact timepiece for our 5th anniversary, spending 6 months of my own saved income to afford it. Underneath the photo, cross-posted to her own public feed, Camille had written a caption that made my vision blur and my chest tighten. Proud of my husband. The infidelity was a jagged knife, but I needed to know exactly how deep the blade went. I opened a new window and accessed our joint financial dashboards. For years, I had only managed the household checking and basic savings, leaving the complex investment portfolios, corporate distributions, and tax strategies entirely to his wealth manager. Now, I hunted with the cold precision of a forensic auditor. I downloaded months of transaction histories, scanning line by line, looking for the anomaly. Hidden beneath pages of mundane corporate expenses, I spotted it. A recurring, automated deposit categorized as a corporate housing reimbursement. The amounts were staggering, thousands of dollars funneling out of an account I never monitored, designated for a lifestyle I did not share. Routed through a subsidiary financial institution, I needed the skeleton of this operation. I logged into our shared credit monitoring account and pulled the report. The progress bar crawled across the screen, each percentage point agonizingly slow. A digital ticking clock in the dark room. When the document finally generated, a secondary address flared on the screen like a bright red warning beacon. It was a luxury high-rise condominium in a downtown neighborhood we never visited. The property was registered under a vague, untraceable limited liability company, but the registered mailing address for the tax documents was linked directly to one individual, Camille. The financial bleed was devastating, but the final discovery shattered the ground completely. I accessed his private cloud storage, bypassing the shared family vacation folders and diving into the encrypted legal directories. Inside a subfolder labeled with a sterile string of alphanumeric codes, I found a scanned document. It was a legal waiver, a spousal consent form required for transferring immense blocks of equity during a recent venture capital acquisition. My eyes scanned the dense, microscopic legalese, dropping to the bottom of the final page. There, signed in thick blue ink, was a signature, Harper Park. I stared at the glowing screen until my eyes burned and watered. I have never, not for a single day of my entire life, used the name Park. I retained Rivera on every legal document, every passport, every tax return, and every bank account. The signature was a flawless, practiced forgery. A terrifying clarity washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. Julian had not simply hired a mistress or funded a secret apartment to escape marital boredom. This was not a mundane romance scandal. This was highly sophisticated, calculated paperwork warfare. He was actively utilizing my legal existence to leverage massive financial power, securing funding and moving assets, while simultaneously erasing my physical identity to protect his corporate kingdom. He was quietly building a fortress of fraud. And I was the unknowingly mortgaged foundation. If his company ever collapsed, or if he defaulted on those heavily leveraged assets, I would be legally bound to the destruction of a life I did not even know existed. The silence of the house felt incredibly heavy now, weighted with the severe gravity of federal crimes. I routed the documents to the laser printer hidden in the credenza. The machine whirred to life, a mechanical heartbeat in the dark, spitting out page after page of undeniable, ruinous proof: the forged signature, the credit report, the retreat photos, the housing reimbursements, the emergency contact log. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, my hands moving with cold, robotic efficiency. I pulled a heavy 3-ring binder from the bottom drawer of his desk. I slid the thick stack of documents inside, snapping the metal rings shut with a sharp, decisive crack that echoed in the quiet room. I found a thick black marker in his leather pen cup. On the crisp white spine of the binder, I pressed the felt tip down and wrote 2 words in bold. Unyielding capital letters. The truth. I was no longer a betrayed, grieving wife. I was an investigator standing at the edge of a crime scene, and I was going to dismantle him piece by piece. Exactly 48 hours after I walked out of that gleaming glass lobby, I walked right back in. I wore a tailored slate gray suit, my hair pulled back into an uncompromising knot, projecting an aura of absolute, unbothered control. I approached the sweeping reception desk and requested Kendra Slate, stating calmly that I needed to formally withdraw my application in person and return a few proprietary assessment materials. I knew she would not turn me away. I was a live grenade rolling around on her meticulously clean corporate floor. Kendra met me near the elevator banks. Her complexion was noticeably paler than it had been 2 days prior. Her signature corporate warmth replaced by a brittle, defensive tension. I watched her hands as she greeted me. Her fingers clutched her digital tablet so tightly, her knuckles were stark white against the dark casing. It clicked for me instantly. Human resources directors at billion-dollar technology firms do not lose sleep over a chief executive officer having a standard. Messy office affair. They lose sleep over massive, company-destroying legal exposure. She knew, or strongly suspected, that the rot blooming inside Astorvale Systems went far deeper than a shared bed. She did not guide me back to her beautiful glass-walled office. Instead, she led me down a quiet, secondary corridor toward the back of the building. Swiping her badge to open a small, windowless conference room, the moment we were inside, she firmly shut the heavy oak door and immediately lowered the opaque privacy blinds on the interior glass panels. We were not alone. A man was already sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table, a thick manila folder resting squarely in front of him. Kendra introduced him in a hushed, nervous voice. This was Miles Granger, the lead of internal audit. He was a sharp-featured man in his late 40s, wearing a slightly rumpled dress shirt and an expression of profound exhaustion. He looked exactly like a man carrying the heavy, toxic weight of a secret he desperately wanted to drop. I sat down directly across from him, resting my hands flat on the cool surface of the table. I told them both I was not there to scream, cry, or cause a public scene, but I was absolutely not leaving until I understood the operational scope of my husband's other life. Miles did not offer me pity. He offered me raw data. He opened his folder and began sliding printed ledgers toward me. He explained, his voice low and steady, that for the past 14 months, he had been quietly tracking severe expense anomalies. He detailed exorbitant charges billed vaguely as client retention. We were talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing seamlessly into private aviation charters, luxury black car services, and duplicate event sponsorships where the company had effectively paid twice for the exact same corporate footprint. The real twist, the terrifying anomaly that made Miles risk his own career to sit in this locked room with me, was the authorization trail. He pointed to a specific column on the budget sheets. Camille possessed a tier of financial approval authority she absolutely should not have held, given her official operational title. Her signature, a sharp, angular scrawl, appeared repeatedly on massive capital transfers that deliberately bypassed standard executive controls. She was moving staggering amounts of company money like a shadow executive, completely unchecked by the traditional hierarchy. I looked at Miles, expecting him to declare that he was taking this mountain of evidence straight to the board of directors to clean house. I expected him to be the righteous whistleblower, but he shook his head slowly, a bitter smile touching the corners of his mouth. He was a corporate survivor, not a martyr. He leaned forward and warned me to tread incredibly carefully. Julian had built that board from the ground up over the last 7 years. He had personally handpicked those investors, those strategic advisors, and those silent partners. Miles stated bluntly that these powerful people owed my husband their immense wealth. They would protect the stock price, and by extension, Julian. Long before they ever protected the truth, the financial fraud was a complex, tangled knot, but there was a much simpler, far more painful thread I needed to pull. I turned my attention back to Kendra. I asked the one question that had been keeping me awake, the question no one in that room wanted to answer. I asked if the executive leadership team even knew that I existed. Kendra looked down at her lap, suddenly unable to meet my gaze. The silence stretched until it felt like it might snap. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper as she confessed the narrative Julian had carefully spun. He had not erased me entirely, because complete erasure of a legal spouse would invite background check suspicion. Instead, he had meticulously and maliciously rewritten my entire personality. Kendra admitted that Julian told the leadership team his wife was an intensely private woman. He claimed I was chronically unwell, incredibly fragile, and vastly preferred to stay completely out of the public eye. He painted a masterful picture of a burdensome, shut-in spouse who needed to be protected from the demanding corporate spotlight. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it hit me like a physical strike to the jaw. He did not just betray my trust or systematically steal our shared assets. He had assassinated my character while I was at home managing our contractors, handling our taxes, and keeping his entire personal world spinning flawlessly. He had crafted a tragic, pathetic phantom out of my name to ensure no one would ever question my absence at galas, dinners, or corporate retreats. He made absolutely sure nobody would ever come looking for me. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. I processed the magnitude of the gaslighting, locking the emotional devastation away in a dark, cold corner of my mind to be dealt with later. Right now, I needed leverage. Miles slid one final, thin sheet of paper across the table. It was a blank internal grievance form. He looked me dead in the eye and offered a single, precarious lifeline. He explained that as a corporate auditor, he could only legally share what was strictly necessary for internal compliance. His hands were bound tightly by corporate policy and rigid non-disclosure agreements. However, if I formally submitted this document, if I officially became an active, documented complainant alleging financial misconduct tied to executive leadership, his internal investigation would have a legal mandate to proceed, and he could officially share his findings with me. I looked down at the blank line waiting for my signature. It was an invitation to go to war, not just as a scorned wife, but as a corporate liability. I picked up the pen. I did not go home after submitting that form. I drove straight to the downtown district, navigating the narrow streets until I found the converted warehouse that housed Bright Harbor Collective. My former mentor, Gwen Calder, had launched the boutique growth firm 5 years ago, building it into a quiet, ruthless powerhouse in the corporate strategy sector. I walked into her industrial chic office unannounced. Gwen was 50 years old, sharp as cut glass, and possessed a gaze that could strip the paint off a brick wall. I sat down across from her and laid out the entire situation in plain, unvarnished English. I did not cry. I just gave her the terrifying facts of my newly discovered reality. Gwen did not gasp in shock. She did not reach across the wide desk to hold my hand or offer useless, soft platitudes about how deeply sorry she was. She simply leaned back in her ergonomic chair, steepled her fingers together, and asked me a single, defining question. She asked if I wanted to win emotionally, or if I wanted to win legally. I told her I wanted to dismantle him down to the foundation. Gwen hired me on the spot. It was not an act of charity or pity for a betrayed wife. My portfolio from my late 20s was still brilliant. My strategic mind was entirely intact, and Bright Harbor was actively hunting for a senior director to manage a massive new tech portfolio. We agreed on a base salary of $180,000 a year, accompanied by aggressive performance bonuses, for the first time in nearly a decade. I had a substantial income stream that Julian could not touch, track, or financially control. The promise of that first paycheck dictated my next silent moves. The following morning, I walked into a regional bank branch on the opposite side of the city, an institution completely unaffiliated with Julian's elite wealth management firm. I opened an independent checking and savings account under the name Harper Rivera. I rented a secure safe deposit box in their concrete vault and filled it with my passport, my birth certificate, my social security card, and the master digital thumb drive containing my ever-growing binder of evidence. I spent an entire Tuesday afternoon sitting in a loud, anonymous coffee shop, systematically changing every single digital password I owned. I locked down my personal email, my cellular provider account, and my cloud storage with randomized 30-character strings, forever abandoning the anniversary dates Julian could easily guess. Finally, I contacted all 3 major credit bureaus and placed a hard security freeze on my social security number to prevent any further forged financial maneuvering. with my basic logistical perimeter secured. Gwen gave me a name, Maren Klein. She was a divorce attorney who specialized exclusively in high net worth, complex asset dissolution, and corporate uncoupling. Maren did not have flashy billboards or boastful television commercials. Her office was in a quiet, unmarked suite on the 18th floor of a sterile corporate building. When I finally met her, Maren was terrifyingly calm, a woman who spoke in low, measured tones and took meticulous, surgical notes on a yellow legal pad. Maren listened to my narrative without a flicker of emotion, reviewing the forged spousal consent document and the duplicate housing reimbursements I had printed. She explained immediately that the cheating was just background noise to a judge. The real battlefield, she said, was the marital estate itself. It was the forged legal documents, the unvested executive stock options, the hidden limited liability company, and the deeply entrenched financial abuse. Julian had not just broken his wedding vows, he had committed verifiable fraud to secure venture capital, using my legal identity as collateral while actively suppressing my existence. Maren introduced me to the concept of legal discovery. She described it not merely as a procedural court step, but as a weaponized language. A brutal, relentless mechanism that forced corporate shadows into the agonizing light. She promised me that through the aggressive use of discovery, we would subpoena internal servers, depose his loyal executives under oath, and turn every single one of Julian's arrogant lies into admissible, devastating evidence. Armed with Maren's ruthless legal framework, I turned my home office into a silent war room while Julian was out playing his role of the dedicated, overworked chief executive. I built a master digital timeline. I painstakingly cross-referenced the Astorvale corporate calendar with his personal credit card statements, my downloaded financial ledgers, and Camille's digital social media trail. I documented every single trip he claimed was an emergency server deployment, every charge at a high-end steakhouse he wrote off as client retention, and every weekend he spent at that downtown luxury condominium while I was alone in our sprawling, empty house. I tracked the flow of money down to the very last cent. The timeline spanned 3 entire years, a meticulously categorized spreadsheet of betrayal that completely removed all emotion and left only cold, hard, prosecutorial data. I also took one final crucial step to protect my own sanity. I hired a private clinical therapist. It was an out-of-pocket expense. I paid out of pocket so it stayed off our shared insurance statements. I did not go to therapy because I felt broken or fragile. I went because Julian was a master manipulator, a man who had successfully convinced his entire board of directors that I was an unstable, agoraphobic recluse. I needed a trained professional to actively ground me in absolute reality. I refused to let his insidious gaslighting seep into my inner voice and distort my perception. I needed my mind incredibly sharp, objective, and entirely mine. I spent exactly 1 hour every Wednesday morning reinforcing my own truth, ensuring that when the psychological warfare inevitably began, my mental armor would be utterly impenetrable. Through it all, I lived in the exact same house as the man who was actively destroying my life. We slept in the same massive, custom bed. We ate dinner at the same cold marble table. I smiled warmly when he talked about his stressful, demanding days. I poured him his sparkling water with a steady hand. I asked him how his keynote speech preparations were coming along. Feigning genuine interest, I played the role of the devoted, oblivious wife flawlessly, because I had established one absolute, unbreakable rule for myself. There would be absolutely zero yelling. There would be no dramatic hallway confrontations, no throwing plates against the wall, and no tearful demands for an explanation. Emotion was a severe liability I could no longer afford to carry. Every single breath I took, every word I spoke, and every smile I faked was driven by one defining purpose: only strategy. I booked a table for 8 o'clock on a Thursday at a dimly lit Italian restaurant tucked into a quiet, affluent corner of the city. We had not stepped foot inside this specific establishment in exactly 6 years. It was the exact leather booth where we had split a cheap bottle of red wine to celebrate Astorvale's very first seed funding round. Back then, he had looked at me across the scuffed wood and promised we were building a monumental empire together. Tonight, I was wearing a crimson silk dress he used to admire, sipping sparkling water, waiting for the Emperor to arrive so I could watch him squirm. He walked in 20 minutes late. He always did. Julian moved through the crowded dining room with that effortless, kinetic energy that naturally drew every eye in the room. He was the absolute picture of the visionary founder. Casually handsome in a dark tailored jacket over a crisp white shirt, his phone gripped tightly in his right hand. He slid into the booth opposite me, offering a brilliant, deeply apologetic smile that could easily disarm a firing squad. He leaned over, kissed my cheek, and immediately launched into a rapid-fire explanation about a board meeting running long and a sudden server migration crisis that required his absolute attention. He was distracted, charming, and radiating the exact busy aura that had allowed him to get away with absolute murder for the past 3 years. I let him talk. I ordered us a very expensive vintage wine to match his current tax bracket and listened with wide, perfectly supportive eyes. We made it through the appetizers, a delicate beef carpaccio he barely touched, before I decided it was time to strike the match. I took a slow sip of wine, carefully tracing the rim of the crystal glass with my index finger. "I did something a little impulsive earlier this week," I said, keeping my voice incredibly light and completely devoid of any sharp edges. "I was feeling a bit restless with all the free time at the house, so I applied for a job." Julian was in the middle of cutting his veal. His knife stopped moving completely. He looked up, a fond, slightly patronizing smile still lingering on his lips. "Really? That is great. Consulting again? Or maybe you are looking into a nonprofit foundation?" "Actually, I interviewed at Astorvale," I replied, holding his gaze perfectly steady. I watched the physical reaction cascade across his features in real time. It was utterly fascinating, a microscopic expression of pure, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his face so fast he looked practically translucent in the dim restaurant lighting. His jaw locked tightly, and the charming smile fractured. Hanging on by a microscopic thread of sheer willpower, for 2 agonizing seconds, the polished chief executive was gone, replaced entirely by a man feeling the floorboards drop out from under him. Then, the aggressive survival instincts kicked in. He forced a dry, breathless chuckle, carefully setting his silver knife down. "Astorvale? You are kidding. Why on earth would you want to work there? It is an absolute meat grinder right now. Besides, you do not need to work. Harper, we have more than enough. I want you to enjoy your life, not stress over quarterly projections and metric reports." He was desperately trying to redirect the current, steering us violently back to the familiar, safe narrative of the protective, wealthy provider. I did not let him grab the wheel. "It was the senior strategy role," I continued, resting my chin on my hand, projecting an aura of complete innocence. "I figured I knew the brand philosophy better than anyone. I even had a great sit-down with Kendra Slate in Human Resources. But it is the funniest thing. Julian," his eyes were completely hollow. He picked up his wine glass, but his hand was rigid, the tendons in his wrist standing out sharply. "What is that?" Kendra was incredibly impressed with my portfolio, but she said they could not move forward with the application. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to suffocate him. "She said there was already a Mrs. Park working there." Julian drank. He swallowed the wine entirely too fast. When he set the glass down, the heavy crystal base hit the wooden table with a sharp, echoing thud. His response came back instantly, fired off with zero hesitation. It was entirely too fast, heavily rehearsed, and completely devoid of the genuine confusion an innocent man would display. "Oh, that," Julian said, waving his hand dismissively through the air. "That is just a bizarre administrative coincidence. Park is a massively common surname. especially in the tech sector. We probably have half a dozen parks in the corporate directory right now. Kendra is just being overly cautious about compliance and nepotism optics. Honestly, do not even overthink it. I will have a stern word with her tomorrow about being so ridiculously rigid. He lied straight to my face with the breathtaking ease of a career sociopath. If I had not seen the forged signatures in his private cloud drive, if I had not painstakingly tracked the duplicate housing reimbursements to a luxury downtown condominium, I might have actually believed the casual, irritated tone in his voice. I did not push him. I did not slam my fists on the marble table or demand to know Camille's operational title. I simply smiled, a warm, bright expression that reached all the way to my eyes, and effortlessly changed the subject. I asked him about his upcoming venture capital trip to Chicago. I could visibly see the immense, dizzying wave of relief wash over his entire body. He eagerly grabbed the new topic like a man drowning, rambling breathlessly about investor meetings and hotel logistics. He actually thought he had survived. He thought the crisis was completely averted. He did not realize that I never wanted his tearful confession in that restaurant. A confession is just a conversation, easily denied later. I wanted his mistake. The psychological poison began working the absolute second we returned to our sprawling house. Usually, Julian would have one final drink in the living room and fall deeply asleep by 11 o'clock. Tonight, the energy radiating from him was highly volatile. He quickly excused himself to his private study, claiming he had to urgently review a sudden legal draft. I lay in our massive bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, listening to the muffled, frantic pacing echoing from the other side of the hallway. I heard the low, urgent murmur of his voice bleeding through the drywall. He was making rapid, hushed phone calls at 1 o'clock in the morning. He was a cornered animal desperately trying to keep a dozen fragile plates spinning in the air. Over the next 3 days, the deep paranoia settled permanently into his bones. I logged into our shared digital planner and watched the erratic behavior unfold right on my screen. Entire blocks of his meticulously organized calendar began to vanish without explanation. He started aggressively deleting previous meeting entries, scrubbing specific locations and lunch dates from his digital history. He became spontaneously unavailable during the exact hours he used to confidently claim he was at the gym or out for late client retention dinners. He was frantically covering his tracks, entirely unaware that I had already downloaded and securely cataloged the entire unedited history weeks ago. I sat in the sterile, unmarked office of my attorney, Marin Klein, and described the frantic late-night phone calls and the sudden, aggressive calendar purges. I handed her the freshly updated timeline showing his erratic new schedule. Marin reviewed the printed notes, her sharp face an unreadable mask of cold, professional satisfaction. She capped her expensive pen and looked at me steadily across the wide desk. "You played that perfectly. Harper," Marin said, her voice a low, steady hum. "He is absolutely terrified. He does not know what you actually saw in that human resources office, and he does not know who you have spoken to since. Right now, his own imagination is doing infinitely more damage than a direct accusation ever could." She leaned forward, tapping a perfectly manicured finger against the thick manila folder containing his financial secrets. "He is spooked, and spooked men always slip." The encrypted message from Miles Granger arrived on an encrypted messaging app I had downloaded specifically for our communications. It contained only 2 sentences. "The board of directors is holding their quarterly financial review in exactly 14 days. If you are going to detonate this, do it before he locks in the fiscal year projections." The ticking clock had officially started. I drove to Marin Klein's office the very next morning. We transformed her conference room into a war room, spreading out the physical evidence across the massive oak table. There was no room for emotion here, only absolute, undeniable mathematics. We assembled a devastatingly clean packet. It contained the exact dates of the fraudulent trips, the specific expense codes used to bypass standard accounting, the duplicate housing reimbursements, and the property records tying the downtown luxury condominium directly to Camille, the crown jewel of the packet, placed right at the front. was the high-resolution scan of the forged spousal consent document used to leverage marital assets. I had zero intention of leaking this to the press or anonymous industry gossip blogs. Public scandals can be spun by expensive public relations firms. Financial fraud cannot. Instead, I bypassed the Astorvale corporate firewall entirely. I used a secure, untraceable server to send the entire packet directly to the personal email addresses of all 7 board members. I sent it to their private accounts late on a Sunday evening, ensuring Julian's executive assistants and his internal security team could not intercept, filter, or delete the attachments before they were opened. Simultaneously, Marin unleashed the legal hounds. She filed a formal litigation hold and a strict notice to preserve records, serving it directly to Astorvale's general counsel by registered mail. It was a brutal, preemptive strike. If Julian or anyone on his technical team conveniently experienced a sudden server crash or accidentally wiped an executive hard drive, it would no longer be a convenient technological glitch. It would be a severe federal crime of destroying legal evidence. To close the trap completely, I formally submitted my official whistleblower complaint through the internal corporate portal. I explicitly named Julian Park and Camille Park, detailing the exact nature of the financial misconduct and the inappropriate abuse of executive approval authority. I effectively handed a live grenade to Kendra Slate in Human Resources. She now had a federally protected, documented complaint. She was legally forced to initiate an independent investigation immediately, or she and the entire Human Resources Department would become completely complicit in the cover-up. The corporate chessboard was officially locked down. Meanwhile, inside the walls of our house, the atmosphere shifted drastically. The paranoid, frantic pacing from the previous week completely vanished, replaced by a sickeningly sweet performance. Julian suddenly transitioned into the attentive, deeply romantic husband he had not been since his startup days. He started coming home at 6 p.m. He brought expensive, elaborate bouquets of white lilies, my absolute favorite flowers, leaving them on the kitchen island. He stood in the kitchen while I cooked, wrapping his arms around my waist, burying his face in my neck, and softly apologizing for being so distant lately. He suggested we take a spontaneous vacation. He told me to pack my bags, promising we could spend 10 uninterrupted days in Paris, or maybe fly down to a private villa in Costa Rica. It was classic, textbook damage control expertly disguised as a sudden rekindling of love. He was trying to neutralize the threat he felt in that Italian restaurant, attempting to sedate me with luxury and affection, so I would not look too closely at the cracks forming in his foundation. I played the part flawlessly. I leaned into his embraces. I smiled warmly at the flowers. I told him a 10-day trip sounded absolutely wonderful, asking him to look at flights for the 3rd week of the following month. I kept my voice soft and agreeable, providing him with the exact false sense of security he desperately needed while the legal machine I built quietly accelerated in the background. Then, the perimeter I had established began to be tested by someone else. A notification popped up on a private social media account I rarely used. It was a message request from Camille. The first message was incredibly polite, almost painfully careful. She introduced herself vaguely as a colleague of Julian's and asked if I had a few minutes for a discreet phone call. I did not respond. I did not even mark the message as read. 48 hours later, a second message arrived. The tone was noticeably sharper, demanding to know if I was the one contacting the legal department. Again, I let it sit in the digital void. The silence was absolute power. I was not going to engage in a messy, emotional back and forth with the woman wearing my name. But Camille was not the only unknown variable. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I arrived at my office at Bright Harbor Collective to find a thick, unmarked manila envelope resting squarely on my keyboard. There was no return address, no postage, and no name on the front. Someone had physically bypassed the front reception desk to leave it there. I locked my office door before tearing the heavy paper open. Inside was a single, glossy, high-resolution photograph. It was a candid shot taken from across the street, showing Julian and Camille entering the glass doors of the downtown condominium building. He had his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. They looked comfortable, domestic, and utterly entwined. Taped to the back of the photograph was a small square of white paper. There was only one sentence typed across it in plain black ink. "He told her you left him." The air rushed out of my lungs. I sank into my desk chair, staring at the 6 typewritten words that instantly completely reframed the entire battlefield. I had spent weeks assuming Camille was a willing, calculating accomplice in my destruction. I thought she was a corporate climber who knew exactly whose life she was hijacking, but the anonymous note shifted the paradigm entirely. If Julian had convinced her that our marriage was already over, that I had abandoned him years ago, then she was not just his partner in fraud, she was his secondary victim. He had trapped us both in 2 completely different, meticulously crafted fictional universes, reigning as the undisputed king of both. The game was no longer just about taking back my money or my pride. It was about tearing down the simulation entirely. I was sitting at my desk at Bright Harbor Collective exactly 5 days later when the corporate detonation finally occurred. At precisely 10:15 in the morning, my secure burner phone vibrated against the wood. It was a brief, encrypted audio message from Miles Granger. He was calling from a stairwell inside the Astorvale building, his breath ragged, and his voice laced with pure adrenaline. The quarterly board meeting had turned into an absolute slaughterhouse. According to Miles, Julian had walked into that boardroom radiating his usual untouchable, visionary confidence, completely unaware that the 7 people sitting around the mahogany table had spent the entire weekend dissecting the explosive packet I had sent to their private servers. When the lead investor confronted him with the duplicate financial ledgers, Julian did not immediately crumble. He went on the offensive. He stood at the head of the table and vehemently denied every single allegation, attempting to dismiss the entire packet as a massive, elaborate fabrication. Then, he played the exact card I knew he would. He looked his oldest investors in the eye and solemnly claimed that I was suffering from a severe, long-term paranoid breakdown. He called me dangerously vindictive, wildly unstable, and completely detached from reality. He asked for their sympathy, painting himself as the tragic, long-suffering husband trying to manage a hysterical spouse. He almost had them convinced. His charisma was a highly weaponized tool. But then Miles Granger stood up. Miles completely bypassed the emotional accusations of infidelity and simply projected the hard, undeniable forensic data onto the massive presentation screen. Numbers do not scream. Numbers do not throw tantrums. Numbers do not have mental breakdowns. The duplicate housing reimbursements flowing into the Shadow Limited Liability Company were laid bare. And then, the killing blow landed. Miles displayed the high-resolution scan of the forged spousal consent document used to leverage millions of dollars in venture capital. The silence in that room, Miles told me, was deafening. The board of directors realized in real time that protecting their charismatic founder meant knowingly becoming an accessory to severe federal financial fraud. The vote was instantaneous and entirely unanimous. By 11:30 in the morning, Julian Park was forcibly stripped of his digital administrative access, required to surrender his corporate devices, and placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a massive, independent forensic investigation. The fallout storm breached the building walls before noon. The corporate dominoes fell with terrifying speed. Major venture capital partners started calling the executive line demanding immediate emergency briefings. 2 massive strategic integration deals that Astorvale had been aggressively negotiating for 6 months were paused indefinitely. The company had spent 7 years relentlessly marketing itself as the absolute gold standard of integrity culture and transparent leadership. By Friday evening, that meticulously crafted brand identity had become a cynical running punchline on every major financial news network and industry blog in the country. Camille did not wait for the forensic auditors to comb through her emails. She executed a swift, brutal exit strategy. She resigned publicly on a major professional networking platform, releasing a highly polished statement claiming she had been severely and intentionally misled by executive leadership regarding corporate policies and marital statuses. She positioned herself entirely as an unwitting pawn in a toxic, deceptive ecosystem. A massive faction of the employee base immediately rallied behind her, praising her bravery for stepping away from a toxic founder. Sitting in my silent home office, I fully expected to feel a massive, suffocating surge of bitter hatred toward her. I wanted to despise her for walking away completely clean while my life was in ashes. But then I opened my restricted social media inbox and finally read the messages she had sent me days prior. Her words were sharp, angry, and defensive, but the context was shattering. She explicitly demanded to know why his former wife from a decade ago was suddenly trying to sabotage his current life. The anonymous tip I received was absolutely correct. She truly, genuinely believed I was a closed, distant chapter from his mid-20s, a woman who had walked away long before the money and the prestige ever materialized. Julian had not just lied to me. He had trapped Camille in an entirely separate, brilliantly constructed fictional universe. We were both just collateral damage in his pursuit of absolute control. My personal cell phone quickly became an instrument of psychological terror. Julian called me 52 times over the span of 48 hours. Since he was locked out of our home, he had retreated to an expensive downtown hotel, and the voicemails he left were a chaotic, terrifying pendulum swing of absolute desperation and vicious, unhinged rage. In one message, his voice would be thick and heavy with tears, begging me to meet him in the hotel lobby, promising we could fix everything, swearing he would surrender his entire equity stake just to have me back. 3 hours later, usually around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, a new voicemail would drop. The tears would be gone, replaced by a cold, venomous tone I had never heard in 8 years of marriage. He would promise that I was going to deeply regret crossing him, threatening to drag me through endless, brutal litigation until I was completely bankrupt and thoroughly publicly humiliated. I listened to every single audio file with cold detachment, systematically forwarding them directly to my attorney. Maren Klein did not flinch at the threats. She moved with lethal, devastating speed. First thing Monday morning, she officially filed the divorce petition in county court, but the true masterpiece was the accompanying paperwork. She filed a massive emergency financial restraining order against him, based on the documented evidence of fraud and the forged spousal consent forms. The judge signed the order before noon. The legal strike instantly froze every single joint brokerage account we held. It legally suspended his ability to liquidate his vested stock options and barricaded him from transferring a single dime of our marital assets to offshore accounts. Cryptocurrency wallets, or shell companies. We completely severed his financial oxygen supply. Cornered, humiliated, and bleeding capital, Julian unleashed an aggressive, highly expensive crisis public relations firm. The narrative they attempted to spin was a textbook, deeply misogynistic classic. They began anonymously leaking quotes to prominent tech industry gossip blogs, aggressively painting me as a wildly jealous, estranged spouse who was launching a hysterical, vindictive smear campaign against a brilliant visionary and an innocent, ambitious professional woman. They desperately wanted a public mudfight. They wanted me to log online, desperately defend my honor, and look utterly unhinged and chaotic in the process. I refused to give them a single syllable. I completely ignored the bait. I let them control the temporary, worthless public gossip. Reputation damage was a fleeting, superficial wound that only mattered to people whose power relied entirely on perception. I was not interested in perception. I spent my evenings sitting on the floor of my living room, quietly sorting through boxes of archived, yellowing financial documents from the very first year of our marriage, hunting for something infinitely sharper. I was preparing the final, fatal blow of legal, undeniable ownership. The legal discovery phase did not just open a window into Julian's deceit, it kicked down the entire structural wall of his empire. For 3 exhausting weeks, Maren and her team of forensic accountants combed through thousands of pages of subpoenaed banking records and corporate communications. The narrative that emerged was far darker than simple infidelity or corporate embezzlement. We discovered that Julian had actively weaponized our marriage. The forged spousal consent forms I had found earlier were not isolated incidents used merely to secure a luxury downtown apartment. He had systematically used my forged signature to pledge our primary residence, our joint brokerage accounts, and my personal retirement funds as collateral to secure massive mezzanine financing for Astorvale during a volatile market dip 2 years ago. If his company had collapsed under the weight of his mismanagement, the bank would have legally seized absolutely everything I owned. He had tied me to the tracks while he drove the train. But the most staggering revelation arrived during Camille's official legal deposition. We sat in the sterile, heavily air-conditioned conference room of Marin's office. Camille sat across the wide table, flanked by her own visibly stressed attorney. She looked exhausted, her corporate polish entirely gone, replaced by a defensive, brittle anger when Marin pressed her on why she accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in unauthorized bonuses and duplicate housing allowances. Camille practically shook with rage. She slammed a heavy leather portfolio onto the table and pushed it toward us. She claimed she had every right to those assets because she was his legal wife. From the portfolio, she produced a velvet jewelry box containing a massive, flawless diamond ring. She pulled out a stack of glossy photographs showing her and Julian standing on a secluded beach, holding hands under a floral arch. Finally, she slid a heavy, professionally framed marriage certificate across the polished wood. I stared at the document, the air completely leaving my lungs, but Marin did not flinch. My attorney slowly picked up the framed paper, adjusting her glasses, and examined it with the cold, detached precision of a jeweler inspecting a flawed diamond. Within 60 seconds, Marin dismantled the illusion. She pointed out that the county seal stamped on the bottom corner belonged to a jurisdiction that had legally updated its emblem 4 years prior to the date on the document. The formatting of the registrar's signature block was entirely wrong for that specific state. Julian had not actually married her. He had hired an actor, rented a beach, and fabricated a completely fraudulent marriage certificate just to secure her absolute, unquestioning loyalty. He had staged a fake wedding. Furthermore, Marin produced internal Astorvale equity distribution forms where Julian had officially listed Camille as his spouse. He used this fraudulent designation to bypass human resources compensation caps, promising her 5% of the total company equity to keep her compliant and silent. Camille stared at the fabricated certificate, the blood completely draining from her face as the agonizing reality of her own gullibility crashed down on her. The hits kept coming. 2 days later, Miles Granger called me from a secure payphone. His internal audit had finally breached the deepest layer of the financial rot. The millions of dollars Julian had funneled out of Astorvale through the fake event sponsorships and inflated client retention budgets had not just been spent on private jets and luxury watches. Julian had been quietly siphoning the stolen capital into a completely separate, highly secretive software venture. It was a private limited liability company registered in a tax haven, entirely controlled by him, holding proprietary code that he had stolen directly from Astorvale's own development servers. When Marin formally presented this specific finding to the Astorvale Board of Directors' legal counsel, the panic was instantaneous. The board desperately wanted to stop the bleeding. They formally offered me a massive, quiet settlement. Their attorneys slid a term sheet across the table offering me $12 million in clean, untraceable cash, provided I sign a draconian non-disclosure agreement, drop the divorce litigation, and walk away forever. They wanted to bury the scandal to protect the impending initial public offering. I looked the lead corporate attorney dead in the eye and pushed the paper back across the table. I told them I was not a line item on their quarterly budget. I promised that if they tried to sweep Julian's massive embezzlement under the rug, I would personally hand-deliver the forensic audit to the federal securities regulators and trigger a shareholder lawsuit that would burn Astorvale to the ground. Realizing they could not buy my silence, Julian's defense team resorted to sheer intimidation. During a hostile pre-trial conference, his lead litigator leaned across the table and issued a thinly veiled threat. He stated that if I pursued this aggressive path, they would subpoena my complete medical history. They planned to drag my name through the mud. painting me as a bitter, mentally unstable woman suffering from severe paranoid delusions, weaponizing the narrative Julian had fed his board for years. They expected me to retreat. Instead, I calmly reached into my bag and handed them a certified, legally binding copy of my weekly therapy records. I had not sought psychiatric help because I was losing my mind. The meticulously detailed clinical notes provided by my therapist documented years of Julian's severe psychological manipulation, outlining his textbook gaslighting and extreme narcissistic behavior. The records did not show a fragile woman. They established a highly credible, documented pattern of his abuse, verified by a licensed medical professional. Marin informed his attorneys that if they dared to bring my mental health into a public courtroom, we would use these exact records to legally establish his history of coercive control. The litigator instantly dropped the threat. The walls were closing in on him, but I needed absolute, undeniable leverage. That night, I sat on the floor of my dark living room, surrounded by dozens of dusty banker's boxes I had dragged out from the deepest corner of the basement. I was methodically sorting through our oldest financial records, searching for the very foundation of his empire. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, my fingers brushed against a yellowing, slightly crumpled manila folder buried at the bottom of a plastic bin. I opened it carefully. Inside was a seed stage contract from exactly 8 years ago, signed during the first terrifying 6 months of Astorvale's existence. Back when the company was merely an idea bleeding cash, Julian had always publicly claimed he built his empire completely from scratch through his own sheer brilliance. He had conveniently forgotten this specific piece of paper. It was a legally binding promissory note, tying the company's earliest survival directly to a massive injection of capital I had personally provided. It was money I had liquidated from my own family trust to keep his servers running when every single bank had rejected his loan applications. He had forgotten the paper existed, but the ink was still perfectly black, and the clauses were still entirely enforceable. I held the document in my trembling hands, a cold smile spreading across my face in the empty house. I finally had the key to the kingdom. The final board resolution and our conclusive divorce hearing happened to fall within the exact same week. It was a spectacular collision of corporate and domestic ruin. Marin and I did not walk into the heavily guarded boardroom to negotiate. We walked in to execute. Julian was sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table. Flanked by his aggressive defense team, he still wore his signature tailored suit, but the untouchable visionary aura had entirely evaporated. He looked exactly like a man who had not slept in a month. When the meeting formally commenced, Marin did not bring up the fake marriage certificate or the duplicate housing expenses. She bypassed the recent fraud entirely and reached deep into the ancient history of the company. She slid a yellowing, 8-year-old seed contract across the polished wood. Julian stared at it. At first, I saw genuine confusion knit his brow. He had completely forgotten that specific document even existed, but as Marin read the strict stipulations aloud to the room, the color drained from his face so rapidly, I thought he might physically collapse. The contract detailed the massive injection of capital I had pulled directly from my own family trust during the first 6 terrifying months of Astorvale's existence. But the clause that buried him was not a romantic gesture of support. It was ruthlessly legal. It explicitly stated that in the event of documented financial misconduct or a severe breach of fiduciary duty by the founder, the massive block of voting rights tied to that initial stake would instantly revert to my complete, unilateral control. Julian panicked. He leaped out of his ergonomic chair, his voice cracking violently as he shouted at his lawyers to invalidate the document, but there was no legal loophole. The truth was devastatingly simple. For 8 years, he had paraded around magazine covers claiming he was a brilliant, self-made titan, but he had built his entire monumental empire while standing on a floor he no longer legally owned. The board of directors watched the exchange in stunned silence. They realized instantly that protecting Julian was no longer just a public relations nightmare. It was a guaranteed corporate suicide pact. If they kept him, I could legally paralyze the entire company. Within 45 minutes, the board held an emergency executive vote. They removed Julian Park permanently from his role as chief executive officer, completely severed his lucrative golden parachute, and formally agreed to fully cooperate with the federal investigators. The divorce settlement followed the exact same brutal trajectory. I won the terms aggressively, stripping him of every ounce of his leverage. I took full ownership of the downtown luxury condominium he had purchased for his shadow life. I secured complete financial restitution for every single asset he had depleted, along with an ironclad structured settlement that guaranteed a massive portion of his remaining liquid wealth. I did not do it out of a petty desire for revenge. I did it because it was the precise, calculated cost of repairing the foundation he had so recklessly destroyed. The most surprising moment of the entire week did not come from Julian. It came from Camille. During the final deposition phase, she sat across from the lawyers and testified one last time, but she did not testify against me. She aimed every single ounce of her fury directly at Julian. Her voice shook with rage as she admitted on the legal record that she had been entirely manipulated. Describing herself bitterly as a wife-shaped shield he had used to deflect corporate suspicion and secure his own absolute power. When she finished, I made the final, highly unpredictable move on the corporate chessboard. I formally submitted a recommendation to the Astorvale board that Camille be quietly rehired after stringent operational safeguards were installed. The board members were absolutely shocked, but my logic was entirely sound. Camille was undeniably competent at her job. Her operational skills were brilliant. I refused to let her professional future be permanently punished simply because she had been deceived by the exact same master manipulator who had deceived me. Astorvale was a bleeding, chaotic mess. The board desperately needed someone who intimately understood the internal rot, but remained completely untainted by the scandal. They needed a steady hand. 2 weeks later, I stepped into the role of interim executive leadership. I did not take the position for the glowing press releases or the industry headlines. I took it because absolutely nobody understood the intricate, broken machinery of that company better than the woman who had spent years silently sweeping up its creators' messes. Julian's ultimate downfall landed exactly where it hurt him the most. He lost the money, he lost the prestigious title, and he lost his freedom to walk into a room and instantly command respect. But his deepest, most agonizing wound was the total loss of the one thing he had fought so desperately to control. He lost the story. He was no longer the brilliant, misunderstood visionary. He was just a fraud who got caught. On a quiet Tuesday morning, I sat in the driver's seat of my car outside the sleek glass headquarters of Astorvale Systems. The Texas sun was bright, warming the dashboard. I looked down at my hands resting on the leather steering wheel. They were perfectly still. There was not a single tremor. I pulled out my phone and opened that original, cursed interview rejection email from Human Resources. I read the words one final time, a soft, genuine smile touching my lips. "Mrs. Park did work here," I whispered to the empty car. "But I was the one who built the truth." I put the phone away, shifted the car into drive, and pulled smoothly out of the parking lot, driving forward into a life that was finally, completely, and undeniably mine. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting that like button so this story can be heard by even more people.